What does £1 million of cocaine have to do with a box of urinary catheters? In 2025, the answer was $10 billion. The media called it the $10 billion takedown. But they missed the real story. It wasn't one operation. It was two. And when you connect them, the entire system of modern global crime snaps into terrifying focus. This is a story about a new kind of criminal. An organization that has stopped caring what it sells, only how. While the US military was fighting a kinetic war at sea, seizing a record $11 billion in cocaine, a different kind of TCO, based in Russia, was running a quieter war. They had no drugs, no guns, no narco subs. Instead, they had shell companies, stolen data, and a plan to bill the US government $10.6 billion for a product patients never received. We've been told to think of drug cartels and cyber criminals as two different things. This story proves they are not. This is the story of convergence. It's not about drugs or fraud. It's about a new, domain-agnostic TCO that runs like a global corporation, and its product line is crime itself. In the 2024-2025 period, the term $10 billion takedown entered the public consciousness. It was a figure of staggering scale, implying a singular, decisive blow against organized crime. But the truth, as it often is, was both more complex and more revealing. This figure did not represent one event. It was an understandable conflation of two separate, concurrent, and equally monumental operations, each valued in the $10 to $11 billion range. The first operation was the one we have come to expect, a kinetic, maritime war. U.S. Southern Command and the Coast Guard announced a historic fiscal year, seizing a record £1 million of cocaine. A physical, tangible haul valued at an estimated $11 billion. But at the very same time, the Department of Justice announced its own, quieter victory. A different kind of war, fought not on the high seas, but inside the abstract arteries of finance and data. It was the largest healthcare fraud enforcement action in U.S. history. And at its center was a single scheme, so audacious it was almost invisible: Operation Gold Rush. The target of this operation was not a smuggling route. It was a line item in the federal budget. The weapon was not a go-fast boat. It was a billing code. The organization behind Operation Gold Rush was explicitly identified by the Justice Department not as a simple group of white-collar criminals, but as a transnational criminal organization, or TCO, based in Russia. This TCO did not invent a new criminal model. It simply applied an old one to a new, unguarded, and immensely profitable target. They used a classic drug cartel structure, but the product was not cocaine. It was urinary catheters. Here is how a foreign-based criminal enterprise built a $10.6 billion fraud. The operation began with infrastructure. The TCO leadership, insulated from U.S. law enforcement in overseas safe havens, acted as a central command and control. They operated what can only be described as a franchise model. Their first move was to dispatch foreign nationals, straw owners, to enter the United States. These individuals were not the masterminds. They were disposable assets, analogous to a cartel's regional managers or plaza bosses. Their sole purpose was to act as a cutout, a legal shield. Once in the US, these straw owners, acting on encrypted instructions from their foreign handlers, strategically bought dozens of medical supply companies. This was not a small-scale action. This was the acquisition of a ready-made, legitimate industry, which was then hollowed out and repurposed for a single criminal goal. These companies had real addresses, real bank accounts, and a real history of doing business. All of it was leveraged to create a mask of legitimacy. In a short span, the TCO had built a vast, distributed, and seemingly legal corporate infrastructure. It had its storefronts. But every criminal enterprise needs a commodity. For this TCO, the commodity was not a chemical. It was data. The organization acquired the stolen identities and, critically, the confidential health data of over 1 million US citizens, with victims in all 50 states. This data was the raw material, the key that could unlock the US Treasury. It was likely purchased from other specialized criminal vendors, data brokers operating in the dark web. This demonstrates another layer of the modern TCO model: outsourcing. The TCO didn't need to be experts in data theft, they just needed to be a customer. They assembled their operation from a global, illicit supply chain. With the infrastructure in place and the commodity secured, the TCO launched its attack. They weaponized the stolen data. Through their new, nationwide network of straw-owned companies, they began to rapidly submit fraudulent healthcare claims to Medicare. It was a digital blitzkrieg. The claims were almost exclusively for urinary catheters and other durable medical equipment. These items were never prescribed by a doctor. They were never ordered by a patient. And they were certainly never delivered. This was a crime of pure, automated volume. The TCO was betting that the Medicare system, designed to process millions of legitimate claims daily, could not distinguish its fraudulent flood from the normal flow. They were targeting the system's automated trust, the very efficiency that is supposed to make it work. The sheer scale is difficult to comprehend. The TCO's network of shell companies flooded the system, submitting a staggering $10.6 billion in intended fraudulent claims. This is the definitive proof of the modern criminal evolution. Operation Gold Rush was not a healthcare fraud. It was a transnational logistics and finance operation that chose healthcare fraud as its target. The law enforcement language used to describe this TCO, its international cells, its foreign straw owners, its use of encrypted communications, its complex multi-stage money laundering, was suddenly indistinguishable from the language used to describe the drug cartels being hunted in the Eastern Pacific. This operation reveals a fundamental, strategic shift. The world's most sophisticated criminal enterprises are now domain-agnostic. The network is the TCO. The drug, or in this case, the catheter, is merely its current and most profitable product line. To understand the Operation Gold Rush, TCO, one must discard the traditional image of organized crime. This was not a mafia family or a street gang. It was a corporation, engineered for a criminal purpose. Its structure was its most brilliant, and most dangerous, innovation. This was not a case of simple domestic billing fraud. It was the unmasking of a highly structured, foreign-based TCO that had identified the US healthcare system as a target for extraction, applying a methodology as sophisticated as any narcotics cartel. The organization's design was built on one paramount principle: insulation. The leadership, the true beneficiaries of the $10.6 billion scheme, never set foot in the United States. They operated from safe haven jurisdictions, explicitly identified as Russia and elsewhere. From this untouchable distance, they directed their network. They were insulated by geography, by anonymous shell corporations, and by technology. They used assumed identities and encrypted messaging to communicate with their operatives, creating a chain of command where the links were digital, ephemeral, and almost impossible for law enforcement to trace back to the source. This TCO ran on a franchise model. The leadership, from their overseas C-suite, provided the business plan, the method of attack. They provided the raw material, the stolen data of over 1 million US citizens. And they provided the back end, the sophisticated financial laundering mechanism to exfiltrate the profits. But they needed a front line. They needed an army inside the United States to interface with the legitimate US system. And this is where the structure becomes clear. They did not recruit American citizens. Instead, they deployed their own foreign straw owners. These were not immigrants. They were operatives, sent into the United States for a specific, temporary, and high-risk mission, to be the face of the criminal enterprise. They were, in every sense, a disposable asset. Once these individuals were on US soil, they began to build the infrastructure, acting on precise, encrypted instructions from their foreign handlers. They did not create new companies, which would have drawn scrutiny. Instead, they strategically bought dozens of medical supply companies located across the United States. This act of acquisition was a masterstroke of criminal tradecraft. They were not just buying a name. They were buying a history. They were buying a company's existing licenses, its supplier accounts, and, most critically, its established bank accounts. They were buying a pre-packaged veneer of legitimacy. This created a vast, distributed network. The TCO did not have one large, central headquarters in the US that could be raided. It had dozens of small, seemingly unrelated, storefronts, scattered across the country. If one was discovered and shut down, the others could continue to operate. It was a decentralized system, resilient by design. These companies were the TCO's interface with the US financial and healthcare systems. They were the portals through which the $10.6 billion in fraudulent claims would be submitted. This structure is a direct and chilling parallel to a drug cartel's operational security. The TCO leadership, the C-suite, remained protected in their safe haven, analogous to a cartel boss in a non-extradition country. The foreign straw owners were the cartel's regional managers, or plaza bosses. They were the mid-level management, tasked with the high risk, high exposure, last mile of the operation. The job was to manage the storefronts, ensure the claims were filed, and facilitate the first stage of moving the money. And, crucially, their other job was to be the one arrested if the operation was compromised. The entire architecture was a system of cutouts and firewalls. The straw owner in Florida, who ostensibly owned a medical supply company, had likely never spoken to the TCO leadership in Russia. He received his orders from a handler, who received his orders from another intermediary. This is the new face of transnational crime. It is less Scarface and more Silicon Valley. It is an organization built on operational security, distributed networks, and a cold, corporate calculation of risk. An organization where the frontline soldiers are disposable, and the leadership remains, quite literally, untouchable. A $10.6 billion fraud creates a $10.6 billion problem. How do you move that much money? This TCO's financial architecture was its most sophisticated component. It demonstrated a deep, practical understanding of the US financial system, and its precise vulnerabilities. The laundering process was not a single act. It was a two-stage, on-ramp, and off-ramp model, a bridge from the US taxpayer to the TCO's overseas pockets. First, the on-ramp. The TCO's problem was simple. Medicare, a US government agency, pays in US dollars, via legitimate bank transfers. The TCO needed to receive these funds. The network of dozens of straw-owned medical companies provided the legitimate, corporate bank accounts to do just that. On paper, these accounts were ready to receive payments for services rendered. But this created an immediate vulnerability. A massive, anomalous inflow of millions of government dollars into a small medical supply company's account should have been a blinding red flag. It should have instantly triggered the bank's anti-money laundering controls, or AML, and frozen the funds. The TCO knew this. And they had a solution. They didn't just target the healthcare system. They targeted the financial system itself. They found a critical enabler inside the walls. The Department of Justice, in its indictments, revealed the linchpin of the on-ramp. An arrest was made of a US-based banker, a man who allegedly facilitated the money laundering of fraud proceeds on behalf of the organization through a US-based bank. This complicit insider was the TCO's key. He was their man on the inside, allegedly ensuring the TCO's accounts were not flagged, that compliance officers were not alerted, and that the flood of fraudulent proceeds remained accessible. He had, in effect, turned his bank into the TCO's private clearing house. But once the fraudulent dollars were in these US bank accounts, they were still vulnerable. They were in the US financial system, visible, and, if discovered, could be seized by law enforcement. The TCO's next priority was to get the money out of the US. It needed to be moved instantly, irreversibly, and untraceably. This was the off-ramp. Here, the TCO deployed its most modern tools. The organization, according to the DOJ, deployed a range of tactics to circumvent anti-money laundering controls, to transfer funds into cryptocurrency and shell companies located abroad. Cryptocurrency was the ideal international transfer mechanism. It allowed the TCO to completely bypass the traditional correspondent banking system, which is slow, regulated, and has its own AML checks. Instead, they could convert millions of fraudulent dollars into a digital asset, move that value across the globe in minutes, and cash out in a jurisdiction far beyond the reach of a US seizure warrant. The indictments reflect this precise architecture. One individual, Onel Marquez Rodriguez, was charged with laundering approximately $4.3 million in healthcare fraud proceeds through his own network of shell companies. In a separate indictment, 11 defendants, with names like Imam Nakhmatullah and Svatoslav Jakovlev, all noted as residing outside the United States, were charged with conspiracy to commit money laundering. This was the complete model. A corrupt insider for the on-ramp, to get the money in and keep it clean. And cryptocurrency for the off-ramp, to get the money out and make it disappear. This hybrid model, leveraging corruption inside the legitimate system and technology outside of it, represents the new gold standard for transnational criminal organizations seeking to launder US-sourced funds. It was a fast, resilient, and global financial pipeline, built for one purpose: to steal a nation's wealth, one billing code at a time. The TCO's greatest strength, its ability to submit a massive, automated volume of fraudulent claims, also created its greatest vulnerability. It created a data signature, a tidal wave of anomalous data, and for the first time, law enforcement was equipped to see it. The victory in Operation Gold Rush was not a traditional policing operation. There was no informant, no undercover buy. It was a victory of data analytics. A coordinated effort by the Department of Justice's Health Care Fraud Unit, the FBI, Health and Human Services, and the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, CMS. The key to the takedown was the proactive data analytics and advanced data analytics used by the Healthcare Fraud Unit's data analytics team. This team was able to identify the abnormal billing patterns from the TCO's network of shell companies in real time. They didn't see a single suspicious claim. They saw the shape of the entire criminal enterprise reflected in the data. They saw a web of brand new companies, all billing for the same items, all at maximum volume, all linked by invisible financial threads. They were, in effect, watching the digital blueprint of the crime as it was being built. This data-first approach enabled a revolutionary shift in law enforcement. It marked the end of the old, ineffective, pay and chase model, where authorities waste years trying to claw back stolen funds after the crime is complete. This was a new paradigm: prevent and pursue. And the results were staggering. The prevention. By detecting the fraud early, as it was happening, CMS was able to take immediate administrative action. They identified $4.45 billion in fraudulent claims that were in the pipeline, scheduled to be paid. They hit the kill switch. Of that $4.45 billion, they blocked all but $41 million from ever being disbursed. This $4 billion prevention is the real victory of Operation Gold Rush. It is a figure that dwarfs the $245 million in total assets, the cash, the crypto, the luxury cars, seized across the entire $14.6 billion national takedown. It demonstrates the power of using data and analytics to build a programmatic, immune system for government programs. It was a strategic victory, not just a tactical one. The pursuit, but prevention was only half the equation. The data had identified the storefronts. Now, law enforcement moved in to dismantle the human network. Of the 19 defendants charged in the $10.6 billion scheme, 12 were arrested. The international nature of the operation was laid bare. 4 defendants were apprehended in Estonia, demonstrating cooperation with international partners. But the most dramatic intercepts happened on US soil. As the network was shut down, the straw owners, the disposable assets, ran. 7 defendants were arrested at US airports and at the US border with Mexico. They were, in the words of the Justice Department, cut off, as they attempted to avoid capture. The TCO's frontline soldiers, who had been sent into the US to act as shields, had served their final purpose. They were captured at the gates, running for the same borders their handlers had sent them across. The data had not only stopped the money, it had led directly to the operatives on the ground. At the exact same time, the DOJ's data analysts were fighting their quiet, digital war. A loud, kinetic war was raging on the high seas. This was the other multi-billion-dollar success of fiscal year 2025. This was the one that made the headlines. The Florida-based Joint Interagency Task Force South, or JIATFS, a component of U.S. Southern Command, announced an unprecedented year for counter-narcotics. The numbers were, simply, historic. The task force and its partners, led by the U.S. Coast Guard, had seized a record 1 million pounds of cocaine. The estimated street value, $11 billion. This was a staggering amount of physical product. Enough, by official estimates, to fill 42 dump trucks, a quantity representing some 378 million lethal doses. But this record-breaking year was not an accident. It was not a statistical anomaly. It was the result of a deliberate, new, and aggressive strategy. This historic haul was driven by Operation Pacific Viper. Launched in August 2025, Operation Pacific Viper was a historic partnership between the U.S. Coast Guard and the U.S. Navy. It was described, in no uncertain terms, as a surge of forces. The goal was to flood the transit zone in the eastern Pacific Ocean, the primary maritime highway for cocaine flowing from South America, with an overwhelming number of assets. Cutters, aircraft, tactical teams, a wall of steel and surveillance. The operational tempo was immediate and devastatingly effective. The operation's first major offload, by the U.S. Coast Guard cutter Hamilton, was the largest in Coast Guard history. The crew brought over 76,000 pounds of drugs to Port Everglades, Florida. Within its first few months, Pacific Viper had already seized over 100,000 pounds of cocaine. But the language used by officials to announce this operation was just as significant as its results. It signaled a clear militarization of the counter-narcotics mission. Statements spoke of defending the homeland with overwhelming force, accelerating counter-drug operations, and sending a strong signal to the cartels that we own the sea. This was not the language of policing. It was the language of war. This was the model JIATFS had perfected. As a Department of Defense component, JIATFS acted as the eye in the sky. It used its vast intelligence-gathering capabilities to detect and monitor. It found the targets, the go-fast boats, the commercial vessels, and the elusive narco-subs. Then, it handed off the target to law enforcement. This is where the U.S. Coast Guard took over, performing the interdict and apprehend stage. Often, this meant a Coast Guard law enforcement detachment, or LEDET, launching from a U.S. Navy vessel, combining the Navy's global reach with the Coast Guard's legal authority to board and arrest. This eye in the sky, boots on the deck model was lethally effective. It was a kinetic, high-risk battle of technology and will, fought in the most hostile environment on Earth. It was, by every metric, an undeniable tactical victory. The $11 billion in cocaine seized was $11 billion in capital and product removed directly from the TCO ecosystem. But this victory, as monumental as it was, raised a far more complex and troubling strategic question. When you cut off one head of a $100 billion monster, what does the rest of the body do? The $11 billion seizure was a monumental tactical victory, a triumph of logistics and military-grade enforcement. But in the complex ecosystem of global crime, this tactical success may have been hiding a deeply troubling strategic consequence. This is what criminologists call the Hydra problem. When you cut off one head of the mythical beast, two more grow in its place. In the real world, this means that large, disruptive drug seizures can, in fact, lead to an increase in violence, overdoses, and other negative health effects. The disruption creates a power vacuum. The TCO that just lost a multi-ton shipment is weakened. This triggers a violent struggle, as new organizations fight to replace the one that's been busted, a fight for territory, for supply routes, and for market share. The 2025 UNODC World Drug Report confirmed this exact trend, noting that the vicious violence and competition of the cocaine trade was already spreading. But the Hydra problem has a second, more dangerous effect. It's not just about violence. It's about adaptation. Think of the TCO as a rational, corporate entity. Operation Pacific Viper and the $11 billion seizure just delivered a devastating business message. The Eastern Pacific cocaine route, the one GIATFS now owns, has become unacceptably high risk. The cost of doing business has become catastrophic. The TCOs, like any global corporation, must respond to this market pressure. They must adapt, or die. And they are adapting, in two terrifying ways. First, they are changing their product. The 2025 National Drug Threat Assessment emphasized that the immense harm to the United States is increasingly not from cocaine, but from powerful synthetic drugs like fentanyl, pushed by the Sinaloa and Jalisco cartels. Fentanyl is a cartel's dream. It is exponentially more profitable than cocaine. It is not grown. It is manufactured, cooked in a lab from precursor chemicals. It does not require a vulnerable, long-range agricultural supply chain from South America. It can be produced in Mexico, right on the doorstep of the US market. And, most critically, it does not rely on the same high-risk, long-range maritime supply chains that Operation Pacific Viper was built to dominate. This leads to a critical, synthesized conclusion. The $11 billion cocaine seizure, by making the traditional cocaine business so costly, may be unintentionally accelerating the cartel's strategic pivot away from plant-based drugs and toward the cheaper, deadlier, and harder to interdict world of synthetics. But there is a second, even more profound, adaptation. This same business pressure forces TCOs to diversify entirely. It forces them to find new, non-drug domains to generate revenue, domains that law enforcement isn't watching. Domains like the US healthcare system. The $10.6 billion Operation Gold Rush scheme is the ultimate example of this diversification. It's a high-profit, low-risk, at first, enterprise, run by a TCO with the exact same structure as a drug cartel. This is the Convergence. The $11 billion drug seizure and the $10.6 billion fraud scheme are not just parallel events. They are likely causally linked. They are two sides of the same coin. Two heads of the same hydra. One is a TCO's adaptation of its product, from cocaine to fentanyl. The other is its adaptation of its entire domain, from drugs to data. This is the new, converged threat. And it is not a regional problem. It is a global one. This adaptation, this pressure-induced evolution, is not a theory. It is a physical reality. And it is happening globally. The TCOs are proving the domain-agnostic model not just by shifting from drugs to fraud, but by fundamentally re-engineering their physical supply chains. The 2024-2025 case studies from Africa provide the most startling proof. For decades, the model was simple: production in a source country, like cocaine in Colombia, and consumption in a market country, like the United States or in Europe. The TCOs were in the logistics business, the business of moving the product across the ocean. But that model is now obsolete. The TCOs are moving beyond using continents like Africa as simple transit hubs. They are now establishing franchise production bases, moving the entire factory closer to new markets. And the organizations leading this charge are the Mexican cartels. Case study: the South African meth labs. In July 2024, elite South African police units, the Hawks, acting on intelligence, raided a remote farm in Groblersdal, Limpopo. It was not a small-scale operation. They uncovered a large-scale, clandestine drug laboratory, an industrial-grade facility for producing crystal meth. The estimated value of the drugs and precursor chemicals found on site was over $110 million. Among the 5 suspects arrested were 2 Mexican nationals. This was not an isolated incident. It was a signal. A little over a year later, in September 2025, residents in Volksrust, another rural community, reported a strange chemical smell coming from a nearby farm. Authorities raided the property. They found another industrial-scale crystal meth lab, a factory. Drugs were packed in buckets and lunchboxes, being stored in freezers, ready for distribution. The seizure was valued at $20 million. This time, 6 people were arrested. One was a South African caretaker. The other 5 were Mexican nationals. This was the new pattern, laid bare. Julian Rademeyer, an analyst from the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime, explicitly described this trend as franchising. This is not a simple trafficking partnership. The Mexican cartels are exporting their intellectual property. They provide the technical experts, the Mexican chemists and engineers, who know how to set up and run these industrial-scale super labs. They then partner with local South African syndicates, who provide the logistics, the protection, and the last mile distribution. The why behind this strategic move is twofold, and it reveals the global ambition of these new TCOs. First, market proximity. The cartels are moving closer to their users. South Africa is, by some estimates, one of the world's largest crystal meth consumer markets. The cartels are simply moving production to meet local demand, cutting out the risk and expense of a transoceanic supply chain. Second, and more importantly, the global hub. South Africa is not an end point. It is a springboard. With its porous borders, established international trade links, and world-class ports like Durban, South Africa is an ideal hub for illicit goods destined for the entire globe. A meth lab in rural South Africa is a production center for high-value markets in Asia, Australia, and all of Europe. These labs are not random. They are strategic. Recent cocaine seizures in South Africa's Western Cape have featured packaging and Tesla branding stamps, identical to those used by Mexican cartels. Investigations explicitly link these networks to the notorious Sinaloa cartel. This aligns perfectly with the DEA's 2025 National Drug Threat Assessment, which confirmed the global reach of the Sinaloa and Jalisco cartels, no longer just US-focused, but operating in at least 40 countries. What we are witnessing is the globalization of the TCO in its most literal sense. It is the same franchise model used by Operation Gold Rush, with its disposable straw owners, but applied to physical, industrial chemistry. The TCO provides the blueprint and the experts. The local partner provides the infrastructure. It is a modular, adaptable, and terrifyingly efficient model, one that can be packed up and deployed to any continent on Earth. The TCO franchise in South Africa demonstrates the evolution of production. But to understand the entire system, you must look higher up, to the global headquarters. You must look at the C-suite. While frontline managers and chemists get their hands dirty in remote labs, the true leadership of modern transnational crime runs its empire from the comfort of a laptop, in a jurisdiction that will not touch them. This is the story of the super cartel. And its case study is not a jungle lab. It is a luxury apartment in Dubai. The super cartel is not a single, vertical organization. It is a horizontal alliance, a cartel of cartels. A partnership of the most notorious criminal organizations in Europe, who realized it was more profitable to collaborate on logistics and finance than to compete. This alliance, first disrupted in November 2022 by Operation Desert Light, allegedly controlled as much as 1/3 of the entire cocaine trade in Europe. Its known partners read like a who's who of global organized crime. The Irish Kinahan Organized Crime Group, the Dutch Mokro Mafia, Italy's Camorra, and the Tito and Dino cartel, led by the Bosnian Dutch national Edin Gakanin. These men are not drug kingpins, in the traditional sense. They do not stand on street corners. They do not personally oversee shipments. They are a C-suite of criminal CEOs. And for years, they operated the global empires openly from the United Arab Emirates. Dubai, a confederation known for its financial secrecy and historical reluctance to extradite high-value targets, was their chosen, safe haven. From their protected base, they used a web of shell companies to manage the global logistics, laundering billions in proceeds, far from the front lines of the drug trade in Europe and South America. They were In effect, untouchable. But the 2022 Operation Desert Light, a massive, coordinated effort by Europol, the U.S.D., and other partners, was a direct assault on this C-suite. The operation, which led to 49 arrests across Europe and the UAE, was the first time this safe haven had been breached. It was a shock to the system. But it was only the beginning. The true, global scale of their methodology would be revealed 2 years later, in one of the largest law enforcement operations ever conducted. This was Operation Lionfish Hurricane. Coordinated by INTERPOL in the spring of 2024, Lionfish Hurricane was not just a drug bust. It was a direct, global response to the logistics network perfected by the Super Cartel. It targeted their entire supply chain, spanning 31 countries across South America, Africa, and Europe. The results were astronomical. 206 arrests. $1.6 billion in drugs and chemicals seized. 615 tons of illicit materials in total. But the most significant finding was not the 56 tons of cocaine. It was the discovery of polycrime. The proof that these TCOs are not just drug traffickers, they're illicit logistics providers, moving any high-value, illicit in bulk good. The first clue was the 505 tons of precursor chemicals seized, a record amount. This was the raw material for a vast, future supply of synthetic drugs. The second was the discovery of a narco sub in the jungles of Guyana, a purpose-built semi-submersible vessel. But the most alarming discovery, the one that proves the convergence thesis beyond all doubt, was the seizure of 30,000 commercial-grade detonators. These explosive triggers, diverted from military or commercial mining, had no place in a cocaine operation. They were a link to entirely different, and darker, criminal economies, illicit gold mining, which uses explosives, or, more ominously, terrorism and armed conflict. Operation Lionfish Hurricane proved that the Super Cartel was not just a cocaine organization. It was a logistics as a service platform, a global criminal industrial complex, ready to ship any product, from cocaine to chemicals to the very tools of violence. This report on Operation Desert Light shows the 2022 arrests in Dubai that first exposed the Super Cartel and the Safe Haven operations. The 2024-2025 law enforcement landscape, defined by Operation Gold Rush and the JIATFS seizures, was not a story of two $10 billion takedowns. It was the story of one $20 billion problem. It provides the clearest, most urgent picture of the future of transnational organized crime. And the central conclusion is this: the TCO model has converged. We must stop thinking of drug cartels, and cyber criminals, and financial fraudsters as separate entities. The world's most dangerous criminal organizations are no longer defined by their product. They are defined by their methodology. They have become converged, polycrime enterprises, operating as domain-agnostic, global platforms. They apply their core competencies, transnational logistics, sophisticated financial laundering, and the exploitation of safe havens, to any high-profit illicit business available. The 2025-era TCO product line is now a diversified portfolio. It includes narcotics, as seen in the $11 billion in cocaine seizures and the franchising of meth production in South Africa. High-volume fraud, as proven by the $10.6 billion Operation Gold Rush healthcare scheme. Cybercrime, evidenced by the $10 billion in annual losses from TCO-run scam operations in Southeast Asia. Environmental crime, such as the domination of illegal gold mining, which now generates more revenue than cocaine in countries like Peru and Colombia. Weapons and conflict materials, proven by the 30,000 explosive detonators seized in Operation Lionfish Hurricane. This convergence is being rapidly accelerated by technology. TCOs are using artificial intelligence to generate fake audio evidence for fraud. They are using cryptocurrency as a borderless, instantaneous, off-ramp for their illicit profits. This new reality exposes the Hydra problem. For decades, law enforcement has been in the business of cutting off heads. Targeting a TCO's product, like cocaine, is a monumental tactical victory. But it is not a strategic one. As we have seen, the pressure from the $11 billion drug seizure only forces the Hydra's body to adapt. It grows a new head. It shifts its product from cocaine to fentanyl. Or, it shifts its entire domain, from drugs to healthcare fraud. You cannot kill the Hydra by chasing its products. To kill this monster, law enforcement must target its heart, the core, cross-cutting functions that enable all its operations. These functions are run by the enablers. The true lifeblood of the modern TCO is this gray layer, the complicit lawyers, accountants, and logistics firms. It is the banker, like the one arrested in Operation Gold Rush, who provides the on-ramp to the legitimate financial system. And it is the safe haven jurisdiction, the nation that provides a C-suite for a criminal enterprise, allowing its leadership to run a global empire with impunity. This is the ultimate TCO of the 2025 era. It is a hybrid organization that can orchestrate a $10 billion cyber fraud from Southeast Asia, run a $10 billion healthcare fraud from Russia, and franchise meth production in Africa, all at the same time. It launders the proceeds through a global network of shell companies, illicit gold, and cryptocurrency, while its leadership operates from a protected luxury apartment, untouchable. This is the new, converged global threat. The war is no longer on a drug or a scam. The war is on the network itself.